All right, my name is Justin, and I am a son of God and an addict. And thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I am sober one day at a time since June 19th, 2015. And for that, I am beyond grateful. And one day at a time, tomorrow will be my 6 years, and I am, once again, beyond grateful for that. Welcome to the RECO12 speaker meeting. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust, and sex, food, and gambling, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom webinar each Friday at noon Central for 20 to 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. If you're hearing this meeting in recorded podcast form and would like to participate as a live audience member in the future, please go to RECO12.com, that's RECO12.com, to learn more and submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations. RECO12 is a self-supporting service, and we appreciate your help in keeping us working our 12th step in this manner. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the cost of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to RECO12.com/support, or you can click the link to PayPal in the chat of the live meeting that'll be going up here in a minute, or in the show notes if you're listening in podcast form. When you contribute, please specify the meeting number. This is meeting number 54. Last week's meeting was with Brock Bevel, and he and I had a very good in-person conversation on how addiction and recovery are both hard, but how one's higher power makes it possible. If you missed hearing that powerful conversation or any other meeting we have done, you can listen to them in podcast form by searching for RECO12 Speaker Meeting Podcast on virtually any podcast platform that you use, or you can go to the RECO12 website and find it under the link podcast. Now, this summer, we will have a handful of those types of meetings like last week, since I will be traveling on several Fridays and not available to have a live Zoom meeting. But today is a traditional RECO12 speaker meeting, and we're excited about it. Now, one more word about our speakers before we introduce today's speaker, who is Mike C. When we line up a speaker for a meeting, we ask them to seek guidance on what and how to present so that they can reflect the light that they have been given. That light will inspire hope, meaning, worth, and growth in each of us, the listening audience. Now, let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Mike C., who I recently heard on the SA Fireside Chat podcast, and who blew me away in that podcast. I took so many notes. It was awesome. And I'm grateful he was willing to fill in today and that he will be speaking to us on how urgency is the enemy of recovery. Now, here's a little bit about Mike C. before I turn it over to him. Mike C. has been sexually sober in SA for 37 years. His home group is in Chicago, where he resides with his wife of, not coincidentally, 37 years. He's been speaking about recovery for many 24 hours. I love that line. Take it away, Mike. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Mike. I'm a recovering sexaholic. And just for the record, I'm a recovering alcoholic and frankly, a recovering rageaholic. And as has been said, sober since June 3rd of 84, and SA a little bit longer in AA, and not for too long, but almost a couple of years now sober from rage. So glad I'm here sober today. And glad to be speaking to you. You know, somewhere in the last, maybe 5 or 6 years, I came upon this line. I don't know if I made it up or if I stole it from somebody else. I can't remember, but it said urgency is the enemy of recovery. And I've never given a full talk on that topic. So this is going to be the inaugural. We'll see if there'll be a second one or not, depending on how it goes. But I was asked to speak on it and happy to do it. So maybe I'll just give you a little history to start out with. So I'm 64 years old. When I was 23 years old, I was drinking myself to oblivion. I was a religion teacher in an all-girls Catholic high school. And as I was teaching them religion, I was also sleeping with the English teacher, who was not my wife. And it was a disaster for me because I was raised in an Irish Catholic family, and sexual morals were high on the list of things you were supposed to be kind of keeping up with. And I had the morals and I had the values. I had the problem that I couldn't live up to them. And the main reason that I couldn't was that I was drunk all the time, both on alcohol and on lust. And so no matter how hard I try to stay away from this person, I just kept ending up back in the situation, and just really couldn't stand myself. I mean, literally, people talk about self-hatred. I had tremendous amount of self-hatred because, I had studied to be a Catholic priest, and I had left the seminary and was teaching for a year to kind of figure out where I wanted my life to go. And wherever I wanted it to go, where it was going was down the drain. And I got lucky. My younger sister, who was 18 years old at the time, walked in our house one day and blew up our family because I grew up I have six siblings and my parents, and of the 9 of us, I'd say it's safe to say that 6 of the 9 were alcoholic, and 1 or 2 others, let's say I don't want to be around them when they're drinking. So it was a drunk tank. I grew up in a drunk tank. Everybody was drunk all the time. And it seemed fairly normal because I grew up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood. And I don't mean to disparage my own culture, but everyone is an exaggeration, but lots of people were drunk lots of the time. And, but my 18-year-old sister walked in the house one day and said, I'm a drunk, and I've been going to the basement of the Protestant church and visiting with the Jewish social worker, and she's recommended I go into treatment for alcoholism on Monday morning. This blew up my family. First of all, the fact that she was going to the basement of the Protestant church and talking to a Jewish social worker was bad enough. But that she was admitting there was an alcohol problem in my family, oh my God. And, my father, who I adored, my mom was making lots of noise about how my sister shouldn't go into treatment. And my father, who never said a cross word to my mother ever, except one time, and this was the time he said to her, "Shut up, Joan, she's getting help." And so she went into treatment at 18. I was 23. I was going to all these counseling meetings because the family was supposed to go twice a week to this treatment center. And one day, my sister was out on a pass and she needed to go to an AA meeting. And for whatever reason, because she could have looked at just about anybody in that house and said, "You want to come?" But she asked me, "You want to come with me?" I said, "Okay." And 40 plus years later, I haven't had a drink since. To which I'm grateful to God, and I'm really grateful to my sister. Because like I said, she could have looked at one of my other brothers and said, "You want to go?" And I'd have just sat there, and that might have been the end of it. But for whatever reason, she said, "Do you want to go?" Story of my recovery is I got sober from alcohol for 2 or 3 years, but the lust just kept going. The acting out just kept going. And this time it was my older brother who had got into sexual recovery, who one day was telling me, he'd been telling me like what he had been doing, and I'd been pretending to be the supportive brother while I'm thinking I'm doing the same stuff, and but I'm just not telling. And then he told me one day he'd gotten into recovery, and he started talking to me about that. And one day I was sitting in his car with him, and he was talking. I just burst into tears and said, "Me too." And he took me, just like my sister took me to my first AA meeting, my brother took me to my first, at the time it was SAA, and then in Chicago, most of us eventually joined SA. So, and then in the last few years, and this has to do directly with the topic of urgency as the enemy of recovery, I realized that in many ways my life has been a blessing, but that my temper has still been anything but in recovery. That my ability to overreact with anger and rage has been a problem. So, and I've been sober for that, like I say, for a couple of years almost, and trying for a little longer than that. But so, back when I was still drinking, the woman who is today my wife, we were dating, and we were part of a prayer group through the church. It was kind of a prayer support group. We didn't really have the 12-step tools. We could have used them, but we didn't have them. And but we did this exercise once for each person in the room. There were about 6 of us. They asked all the other people to draw a picture that kind of said what you thought about that person, how you saw that person. And of all people, the woman who became my wife drew a Ferris wheel. And then she was supposed to kind of go through like what it meant. And she said, "You take me to the heights of joy and the depths of misery, and it's a never-ending circle." And I was not pleased, but because I knew it was true, because that was me. When I was up, I was up. When I was done, and that old saying, or maybe you don't, but I don't know if they say it as much as they used to. But an addict is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. That was me. Everything's great. Everything's terrible. I'm the greatest guy who ever lived. I suck. That was my life. I was just constantly reacting, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And this lady who liked me for whatever reason, and apparently still does, because we've been married for 37 years, she saw this and she named it. And so for years, I've known that one. Hey, I'm an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. But this is sort of a cousin to that. In the last few years, I've also realized that I think everything is really important, and I think it has to be settled immediately. Everything is important, and it has to be settled immediately. And that way of thinking in terms of my brain wiring, many faulty brain wires up there, but that particular one has caused me a tremendous amount of grief in terms of both blowing up at people verbally, but also just a lot of, if you'll excuse the term, mental masturbation, constantly fighting with myself in my head. And I'll just give you an example from, was it yesterday or the day before? I can't recall, but my wife and I were taking my daughter, who's 26, out for her birthday. And she's interested in the women's professional basketball, the WNBA, but she'd never been to a game. So we got her tickets for her first game. Now, I'm real old-fashioned, and I know nothing about technology. My idea of buying tickets goes like this. You walk up to an actual box office, you see a live human being, you tell him where you want to sit, he tells you how much, or she tells you how much it costs, and you get 2 physical tickets in your hand. Well, in the last few years, this is disappearing rapidly. So to get these tickets, I had to go through Ticketmaster, which I'm not too bad at, but it said on the thing you could get paper tickets, and it turned out you couldn't, and it was a big, long mess. It took me 45 minutes on Ticketmaster to do what would have taken me 3 minutes in the so-called less convenient days of going to an actual box office. But then they have all these COVID protocols, which I understand. So I had to do some kind of health screening on the phone so that I could get it. Anyway, I was all uptight about it. This is the point. I was all uptight about it. And I said to my wife, I want all this ticket health crap. And this was how I was talking, done before we leave. It's got to be done now. I don't want to get to the stadium and have trouble getting in. And she said something about, well, let's do it on the way down. And I said, no, it's got to happen now, just like that. And I think I just moved my microphone. There we go. Or not my microphone, my camera. But anyways, there it was. Urgency was the enemy of recovery. What I could have said is, I could have led with my weakness. When I lead with my weakness, I almost always enter into a conversation based on recovery. And when I lead with my so-called strength or my anxiety or my urgency, I almost always end up in a conversation that's not looking super recovered to me. I could have said, I'm really nervous, hon. This technology, I can't figure it out. I know I'm just some old guy and all the young people are laughing at me, but the fact is, I'm worried. She's really excited about this game, and I'm worried about getting in. Could we start a little earlier? I could have done, and she would have been like, sure. Instead, she looked at me like, here we go again, and we didn't go anywhere. I calmed down, we got through it. But it's this thing, everything's important, and it's got to be handled now. And a lot of things are important. I'm glad. I really care about things. I'm a passionate person. And if I have an excess of caring, by and large, I'm okay with that, except when it means it's got to be settled now. Why does it have to be settled now? It's that old inferiority complex egomaniac thing. On the one hand, it has to be settled now because I'm Mike C, and I want to feel good, and I don't want to have a problem in my life, so I need to settle that problem. And then the flip side of it is I'm scared. That's the inferiority side. I'm scared it's not going to work out. I got to settle it now because I won't be at peace. And it's really the same thing, but it's two sides of the same coin. And it's caused me a lot of grief. And what I found out in sponsoring people over the last few years, many years, is, when I started bringing this up, because I was saying beforehand, it took me a long time to figure this out. I just was happily going along, being overly urgent, until I figured out I wasn't that happy being overly urgent, and neither were the people I was living with. Excuse me, which was the real problem. So, in sponsoring people, though, I found out that a lot of us, I don't want to say all, because I don't know if that's the case, but a lot of us addicts seem to think everything's really important, and also seem to think it's got to be handled now. So I've started saying things to my sponsees who will call me and say, I got an emergency, call me. And I call them and I say, what's the emergency? I got a flat tire. You got car insurance? Yeah. Does it cover flat tires? Yeah. Can you get a tow truck guy come do it if you can't do it yourself? Yeah. I said, that's not an emergency. It's not urgent. Urgent is my house is on fire and I got 3 people in here and I got to get out. That is an emergency. In that case, urgency is not the enemy of recovery. Urgency is needed because you want to live for some more recovery. You do not want to burn down in the fire. That's an emergency. Your spouse or your parent is having a heart attack. That's an emergency. There are times where we need some urgency, no doubt about it. But most of the things that I think are urgent are not urgent. So I'm a big Cub fan. I live in Chicago. And it's very important to me to get to the games early, get my scorecard because I keep score, get settled in my seat, and not be, as I like to say, under pressure. So in order to not be under pressure that I might get there late, because I don't know what I think would happen if I got to a game late. I never get to a game late. And everyone around me knows if they're going with me, they had better be on time too. And so in order to not feel the pressure of being late for the game, I pressure myself and everybody around me. And by the time I get there and sit down, I feel so much pressure. It takes me the half an hour I got there early to settle down because you can't be late. Well, it's good not to want to be late, but like if I'm late once in a while, it's not the end of the world. But I think it is. And that's the problem. We got a guy in our essay fellowship now. He's sober long enough that he's beginning the process of dating. And we do it in a kind of old-fashioned way in our group. We call it courtship. That I don't know, that word's kind of disappeared from the English language, but we're trying to resurrect it a little bit. Kind of the slow, steady movement of getting to know somebody before you worry about sex and marriage. And, because they get sober and they're like, when can I have sex? Not today. When can I get married? Not today. I tell them something like, talk to me after you've completed your 9th step, which isn't a bad thing, but it's really just to put them off. To like we're not talking about this yet. But eventually you get to this point where you're ready to start dating. And like I say, we do it in a kind of old-fashioned, excuse me, courtship kind of a way. Well, this guy's a great guy, but classic urgency guy. Every single day, he calls his sponsor, who happens to be my brother, so I hear a lot about it, and says, I met with Melanie. I'm just making up the name. And I met with Melanie yesterday, and we went out, and I want to debrief how it went. And, at one point I shared something with her, and she didn't say anything back. And I'm thinking maybe she just doesn't really like me that much. Maybe it's over. My brother's telling the guy, maybe she just didn't have anything to say, or maybe she's reflecting on it and she'll get back to you the next time you get together. Did she tell you anything was wrong? No. Did she give you a nice smile and a hug when you left? Yeah. Did she tell you to call her next week because they've been going out once a week? Yeah. Probably not that big a deal. But the very next day, I'll call in the morning. Say, have you thought anything more? I'll tell my brother, have you thought anything more about what I said yesterday? I need some answers. My brother says, answers to what? Well, I'm confused. What are you confused about? Well, whether I'm going to end up with spending the rest of my life with that woman. No, we're not on that. We're not on that, Chris. We're on one day at a time. We're on the last date went well. The next one's next week. You're not calling her for another 4 days. So what are you thinking about her for? Why don't you get on with your life? What are you supposed to do today? I know this is really obvious stuff. So part of me is like, I don't know if this is helping anybody, but I can tell you it's helping me because this is the kind of stuff that I'll give you another example. At 64, I'm still playing softball every Saturday from April to October. That's the good news. The bad news is it's getting harder and harder because I still sprint like I'm 25. And then I spend the next week, right now I got a massage therapist, a physical therapist. Actually, I have 2 physical therapists, and where they're all trying to keep me on the field. And right now I'm on the disabled list because I tore something. And it's this year I've already missed 4 weeks, but nothing's more important to me than getting back onto that field, which is fine. But all I want to know, I go to see this physical therapist, and after just giving you all this wisdom that I'm giving to my sponsees and the guys who call me about their sponsees about, one day at a time, I'm asking the physical therapist, when do you think I'll be ready to get back out there? And, I tore my meniscus. He says, that's 4 to 8 weeks recovery, buddy. You're at day 10, like, you're getting a little bit more range of motion. The pain's going down, but do you feel like you could run around the bases at full speed right now? I said, no. He said, well, then what are you asking me for? Like, you're asking the wrong question, or it's a good question, but it's not to be asked for at least another 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm sort of like, no. I want to play now. This is like, you're not going to, but I can, my poor wife, God bless her. She's going to get to the gates, and they're going to say to her, your husband, we need to put him on hold. We got to have a lot of conversations about him. But whatever sins you may or may not have committed, lady, you're in because you've lived with him for 37 years. Because I'll be coming home and I'll be saying, well, I feel a little something in my knee and my back's a little off, and I hope I'm going to be able to play this week. And what's the weather going to be like? I could spend the whole week talking about whether or not I'm going to get on the field for 3 hours on Saturday. There's 168 hours a week. And my wife would probably tell you he spends 3 hours playing and 165 worrying about it. Because this is so important. Well, it is important that I try to keep playing as long as I can, but I'm also beginning to learn, and I mean beginning, that it's also important that I'm not going to play forever. And I got to listen to my body. And if I want to play a little longer, instead of racing back out there early because it's urgent that I get out there this week because I'm 64 and I might only have so many weeks left to play, years left to play. Who knows? I could die of a heart attack. I got to get out there. It's like, well, you really want to get out there. What you got to do is heal from your meniscus tear. It's going to take 4 to 8 weeks. So, and my wife never says this to me, but I say it in my own head. So shut the blank up to myself. Stop. But like a good addict, it's really hard for me to stop, especially if I've started, with the urgency piece. It's got to be settled now. People, one of the things that I've been talking about a little bit recently is the serenity prayer. I don't really understand why it's called the serenity prayer. Why isn't it called the serenity, courage, and wisdom prayer? You hear a lot of talk about serenity. You don't hear that much about courage and wisdom. And I've always been a courage guy, which is a good thing. What I mean by that is if there's something going on and I think it's problematic and I can do something about it, I try to do something about it if I can. So that's a good thing. But the bad part about it is sometimes there's a difference between trying to do something about something and thinking you can control the outcome. I don't know about any of you growing up in an alcoholic family, but growing up in an alcoholic family, at some point around the age of 10, I realized something's terribly wrong here. And this was before I started drinking, but my parents were going at it, and eventually my older brother, and then me. And I started writing my father letters saying, Dad, don't you see something's really wrong here? There's some problems in this house, and it seems like it has something to do with alcohol and drugs. And he'd read them and he'd say, thanks for the letter, but basically nothing changed. It didn't do any good. It did me some good probably to write the letters, but I thought if I could, this would be an Al-Anon thing. My wife's an Al-Anon. This would be an Al-Anon thing. Like, if I can just explain to you, like with my sponsees, if I can just explain to you what I see as the problem, the proper way, you're going to see that. You're going to go, oh, yeah, Mike's right. And you're going to change. Yeah, right. Not very likely. So for me, part of the urgency is I think I have the power to change others. Yeah, I want to have the courage to change the things I can. If there's an issue and I think I can speak to it and do something about it. I'll give you an example, and it doesn't matter what side of this you were on. But in the most recent election, I had some serious concerns about how it was going. And I felt a tremendous sense of urgency. Like, this is really important. But I realized, well, what can I do? I can vote, I can donate, and I can work. So, of course, I'm going to vote. I've talked to my wife, made some donations. And then I said, what can we do to work? What difference can two people make? So what we did was we called our friends and we got over 32 people to each agree to write at least 1,000 letters to voters in different places where it would be impactful. And we made a small difference. If you do that, they have a formula and you can figure out approximately how many votes you've influenced. And we made a difference. And that was recovery. Because what I'd have done in the past is I would have thought to talk to nobody else. I worked my butt off. And then if it didn't work out the way I wanted it to, I'd have said it was a failure because I would have had this sense of urgency. I'd have been right that it was important. I'd have been right to have the courage of my convictions, but I wouldn't have had the wisdom to know the difference. And the biggest thing, and I'll close with this, the biggest thing that has helped me in my recovery from urgency, if you will, has been the wisdom to know to ask for help with that, like I learned to ask for help with alcohol, lust, and rage. The wisdom to pick up the phone and say, there's a situation, whether it's in the program, whether it's in my family, whether it's in, the country or my city government, or whether it's in sports, because I'm a big sports, like to the wisdom to pick up the phone and call a sponsor or ask my wife and say, you know what, this is important, but it's not urgent. Help me figure out what I can do and what I got to let go of. So I hope that's of some use. And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you so much, Mike. I loved your talk there. I loved some of the vulnerability there, saying, hey, yes, urgency is the enemy of recovery, but here are some places that I really struggle with it too. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now, before we get to the Q&A section here, and a reminder to our live audience, if you have questions for Mike, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those as they come in. But Mike, do you mind taking just 60 seconds and talking about the two fellowships that you mentioned and how they help you in your life on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Well, SA, like I said, I've been sexually sober for 37 years. SA defines sobriety as no sex outside of marriage, basically. And that works for me because I was having sex in a lot of places but marriage, and now I'm just having it there on occasion, and it's fine, But the thing I found about that program is there's a unity around that sense, and that unity has allowed for some really deep sharing on some vulnerable stuff. Growing up as an Irish Catholic, the one thing you never talked about was sex. I mean, in the rare times that you did, you just lied about it because other than like with yourself or you know that or there wasn't that much of it. You weren't doing anything that was as great as you said you were. You were just lying to your friends and being told no by your pastor and your parents and having to figure it out by yourself. So to find a place where you could actually have real conversations, and most of them have over time become less and less about the physical aspects of sex and more about intimacy and relationships. But to just have a place where that can be talked about honestly, and you don't have to worry about judgment because let's face it, you're in an SA meeting and who the heck's going to show up except somebody else who's powerless over lust too, that's been a great blessing to me. And actually, if you would have told me, I've been sober 37 years, if you would have told me 38 years ago that 50% of my best friends would be recovering sexaholics, I'd have not only told you were wrong, I'd have probably thrown you out of my house and been offended, But that's kind of how it's turned out to be. So
awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I agree with that. If somebody would have told me 10 years ago that most of my friends, a large percentage of my friends would be recovering addicts, I would have thought, man, you're insane. But they're the best people to have as friends. Recovering addicts are the people I know they have my back and they know I have their back. It's a beautiful thing. All right, so we've got a few questions here. And once again, if you have questions for Mike, please type them in the Q&A. First question is a clarifying one for me. Desperation. So in the big book, it talks about we need to have the desperation of a drowning man. What is the difference between that and the urgency being the enemy of recovery? I think I get it, but I'd like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that's a good clarification question. So when I was drinking, when I was lusting, acting that lust out on a regular basis, when I was acting that rage out on a regular basis, that was an emergency. That was an emergency because in one way or another, those three illnesses will kill me. Alcohol is obvious, it will kill you physically, but lust can kill you physically. That STDs haven't disappeared. Guys who come in and see their wives with a boyfriend they didn't know about and blow their heads off, that still happens. And rage kills people all the time. Just read the newspaper. So when I talk about urgency as the enemy of recovery, I'm talking about once I'm in recovery. That's a little different from getting into recovery. That was urgent. That was serious. The problem is I treat every little problem with the same urgency as I treated getting over drinking, lusting, and raging. So I don't know if that clarifies it for whoever asked the question or not, but yeah, the desperation pre-recovery, getting into recovery, saying I'll do anything to stay sober, that's great stuff. But the urgency of treating every little thing with the intensity and impatience that I tend to less and less over time since I've started working on this the last 5 or 6 years, but that's a different thing.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up to that. And I think this will help me and maybe others clarify things even a little bit further. Is there a difference between abstinence and sobriety and recovery? And if so, how does that shift in your eyes? What is your experience as to how that shifts and when that shifts?
Yeah. So there's a line in the essay White Book that says, I was not until not was not enough. And I love that line because it's like, at first, you're just trying not to drink. You're trying not to drug. You're trying not to gamble. You're trying not to act out sexually. You're trying not to, punch somebody or scream at somebody if you've got an anger addiction. What I'm sure I can't name all the addictions, but that's a good cross section. So, you got to get sober. So what I say is sobriety is a condition for the possibility of recovery. I'm not a big believer in if my sponsee relapses, we start over at step one. Now, some people disagree with that. Oh, you just keep going. I'm like, well, I'm not going to have a drunk person working on a fourth step. So I'm going to start over. So people who will say, well, I've got recovery, even though I'm not sober. I don't want to get into semantics, and I don't want to get in an argument. I mean, feel whatever you want, but I don't look at it that way. I look at it as sobriety gives me a chance for recovery. And so that desperation for sobriety, that's an urgency I can get behind. But then after a while, you see it especially in SA. You see some people who they manage to stay physically sober. They don't technically act out, but they never get the garbage out of their head. So they might be sober 5 years, but they're constantly tempted. They're constantly sort of walking to the edge of the cliff, and somehow they don't fall off. I'm always amazed. I'm like, God, if I got that close to the edge, I'd fall off. They've got sobriety, but without trying to be judgmental, but just looking, they don't seem to have that much recovery. Then you have the people who say they have recovery, but they don't have sobriety. I just think they're full of crap. But hopefully there comes a time in your recovery as you start really working the steps. I mean, you've made that surrender of 1, 2, and 3. You're working a 4th and 5th step. You're trying to get through those house cleaning steps. When you get to 10, 11, and 12, hopefully you have some recovery in your life then. And, but you're not going to keep it if you go back out there. So.
Yeah, I appreciate your insight there. We had a previous guest speaker on this who talked about being 15 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and being out of his mind because he was an untreated alcoholic. He had not yet gotten to the core of things, and he was still just basically white knuckling it. And I see that. I also see that a lot in the rooms that I attend, where, hey, I'm technically by the letter of the law sober, but out of my mind with the stuff in my mind and heart is just not where it needs to be. How can you share how you have experienced that shift from being technically sober, but maybe an untreated sexaholic or alcoholic, and how that shift happens into maybe the happy, joyous, and free, or the peace of recovery?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, needless to say, it's not an overnight process. When I was newly sober in SA, I mean, I was just trying to get through the day without stopping at an adult bookstore or buying a porno magazine, staring at, you see a pretty woman walk by and you appreciate her. That to me is not lust. When you're still thinking about her 3 hours later, or you're literally following her around the block in your car, or you say, well, you go home and you have sex with your wife that night. So supposedly you're sober, but you're really thinking about the other person the whole time you're doing it. Talk about objectifying and using people, so in the early days, you're just trying to stop that, and you're trying to, and there's a withdrawal, even from lust. I think there's a withdrawal. I mean, I'm no scientist or doctor, but, there's a period where, you're just trying not to do it. And you're trying to get past the point where you feel like you have to do it, and then at some point, and I think it's different for different people. I mean, if I remember correctly, I mean, Bill Wilson, basically, he didn't have a desire to drink much, but Bob Smith, I think, struggled with it off and on for his whole life. So it's different for different people. But for me, what happened was, and I feel so blessed that this happened to me in both AA and SA, I fell in love with the program. I mean, I grew up in a situation where nobody ever told the truth about what they were thinking or feeling. I mean, they tell you about their opinions, but I'm talking about, like you said, the more vulnerable stuff, what was really going on. It just wasn't talked about. You just had to figure it out. And all of a sudden, there's these fellowships where people tell the truth. I'll never forget when I was first in AA. This guy was going through this messy divorce, and he'd come in every day and he'd just bleed all over the group about everything that was going on. I mean, it was raw stuff. And I kept looking around thinking, when are they going to tell him to shut up? Not because I wanted them to, but because I was like, nobody gets to talk like this. Nobody allows this. And I was like, when are they going to kick him out? finally, I talked to some old timer, and he says, "No, we're never going to tell him to shut up, and we're never going to kick him out. He's doing what he has to do to stay sober today." And I just fell in love. I thought, this is the greatest thing that ever happened. Same thing in SA. It took me a little longer in SA because I was kind of embarrassed to be in the perverts club, you know. I'd go in there thinking, boy, these guys, I never did that. He's a pervert. Then one day I'm looking in the mirror thinking, well, you're in the meeting, so what does that make you? You know, same thing, pal. You know, so it took a little longer to fall in love with SA, but eventually I did. And I found the level of friendship and love that occurs between people who are seriously trying to work the program to be the most astonishing thing I'd ever experienced. And so over time, through working the steps, through fellowship, eventually even through learning that groups themselves, particularly in SA, can either aid recovery or aid relapse, and learning to strengthen groups, to be committed to that, like that became sort of a life's work. You know, I mean, I have my regular job and all that too, but like it just became the most important thing in the world to me. So I don't have time to worry about. It's not that I never get tempted to drink or lust. I would say I almost never get tempted to drink, and I get tempted to lust a few times a year, but not very often because I have a full life. And I think that's the real difference between just sobriety and recovery. I don't think you get recovery without sobriety. So even if you've got 15 years and you've been a madman for 15 years, still better that you didn't drink for those 15 years or lust or whatever. I want to be clear on that. But I do think there comes a moment where you begin to move toward less selfishness and more selflessness. And as that happens, you find out it actually makes you happier. You don't think so at first. You think meeting my needs is the most important thing in the world. And then we find out we don't even know what our needs are. You know, I thought my need was to take care of every woman desire. It turned out that if I would surrender a lot of those desires, I didn't really need them that much at all, if at all. What I really needed was to be of use and service to other people. And slowly but surely over time, I've been figuring that one out. And not that everything's, you know, nirvana or anything, but I'm pretty happy most of the time, which I'll take.
Love that. Thank you for the honesty there. All right, we have a question that came in from Jeremy in our live audience. He asks, how do you go about working recovery without psychoanalysis of everything and every situation? Sometimes the more I learn about my issues and why I do what I do, it's hard for me to get out of my own head.
Great question. Great question. Well, you know, when I was early in AA, there was some debating. I think it's kind of gone away about, you know, do you really need therapy or not, or you just need AA? And, you know, there were some old timers who'd say, you know, if you need a therapist, you're just not working your program right, which is a bunch of crap. But so I've had therapists at times. I've needed to do some examination of what makes me tick. Why is it that I'm still so angry when I'm sober from lust and alcohol, and mostly happy most of the time, yet still subject to these violent fits of anger? Like I needed to get some extra help with, and like I said, I've joined a Rageaholics Anonymous program, but I also got some extra help with that. There are times when we need to do that. And we need to have competent people we're doing it with, which can sometimes be a problem. You got to pick the right person. But there also there've also been some times where I needed to let go of that and say, you know, I guess I could go on learning the intricacies of Mike C forever, but I really got a life to live. And I don't have any answers as to when that is in any person's life. I mean, you could have a therapist for the rest of your life, and if it's part of your recovery and helping you balance things, go for it. I don't. It's great. Or you could see a therapist for 2 or 3 years and say, I got what I needed and move on. I don't think it's one size fits all. I think for me, as a perfectionist, I at some point, and I'm still learning this in different areas of my life, at some point, was I able to let good enough be good enough? Was I able to accept myself imperfect? Yeah, I still want to get better, but was I able to accept that it ain't going to happen overnight and it's never going to be completely accomplished, at least this side of the grave? And so get all the help you can get. The other thing for me is in terms of sponsorship, both as a sponsor and a sponsee, I ask my sponsees all the time, what is it you don't want to tell me? Because usually it's something buried in their head. They're doing a mental masturbation dance about something. Might be the girlfriend I was mentioning of that one guy a little earlier. He's doing his dance about his girlfriend. I'm probably doing it about softball. I'm driving myself nuts about a game that lasts 3 hours a week, played by a bunch of old men. You know, you might have something else. You might still be haunted by something from your past, and you might need some help for it on the one hand. And on the other hand, if after 20 years of help, you're still haunted by it, can you just, is there a way to make peace with it? And I'm no expert into how to do that exactly, but I had to make peace with my mother. I had a terrible relationship with my mother. When she died, I loved her to death. Did she change some? Yeah, mostly I did. And that was a process. So to keep it out of my head, I had to bring it to the light of others in the program.
Thank you, Mike. So I kind of addressed this maybe before we started the meeting in the intro, but we had a question come in about ways to hear other talks that you've given or maybe connect with you. I came across Mike C in the SA Fireside Chat podcast here a few weeks ago, and I know that you've spoken in other places and everything like that. Mike, do you have like a central repository or anything like that if somebody wants to get in contact with you or hear more from you?
There's tapes all over of me giving talks at like SA conventions or retreats or workshops. I don't follow them. Like I have 2 or 3 because sometimes people give me my tape afterward kind of thing, but I don't like collect them or anything. But I know that the 2 people that I know of, there's a guy named Lee, and I think he calls this thing Lee's Tapes or something like that. And there's a guy named Glenn Kay. And I know those 2 guys have done most of the taping for SA. So I think if you can, but I don't know the exact websites or any of that, but I think if you look at those 2 names, you could probably come across a bunch of stuff.
Thank you for that, Mike. I appreciate that. All right. Before we start wrapping this up, Mike, one more opportunity for our live audience. If any of you have a question to ask him, please type it in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. But I've got one more question, and then if we don't have another one come in, we'll have you wrap it up here with a final word of wisdom. But what I want to talk about is being slave to the clock. You talk about having to be early everywhere, and I personally really struggle with that. One of my mottos is 5 minutes early is 5 minutes late, and I drive people around me insane.
That's a classic Urgency's enemy recovery line. I don't steal that from you.
Yeah, and I drive my family insane. It takes the peace from everybody. And you mentioned that you still struggle with that. What are some strategies that you use to try and regain a bit of sanity in those situations where and you can see that my loss of peace is affecting others around me?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. When I drive somewhere, I figure out based on miles per hour and all this, how long it will take. And then I give myself that exact amount of time to get there so that if anything goes wrong, I've already set myself up to be upset. So it's like, I want to be on time. It should take 20 minutes and nothing should go wrong. I have a basic belief, despite a lifetime of things going wrong, that nothing should go wrong, and it's a crisis when it does. Whereas my wife has a basic belief that things are going to go wrong all the time, so let's just do the best we can. And I spent years trying to tell her she was wrong and I was right. And now the last few years, I'm trying to do it her way because obviously she's right and I'm wrong. So now what I try to do is, it's going to take 20 minutes to get there, so leave 30 minutes because maybe something will go wrong. The other thing, and it has been a life changer, for up until maybe 2 years ago, I never, ever stopped fully at a stop sign, ever. I did what I call genuflecting, quick up and down, like quick. I never. I just didn't. I was always in a hurry. My wife says, you're always in a hurry, but most of the time there's no need to be in a hurry, such as urgency is the enemy of recovery. And for years I kept telling them, no, you're wrong, and now it's like, no, she's right. But years ago, a guy in the program was visiting here, and he challenged me. He said, I had a great weekend except for one thing. You never stopped at a stop sign. Now, this was 20 years ago, and I started doing it 2 years ago, so I'm a slow learner. But I started doing a full stop, no genuflection, at every stop sign, even if I was late. I can't tell you the peace to have that moment. It's unbelievable. I know it's going to sound crazy, but for me at least, to have that moment where the car just stops and I can, like, nothing's happening and I can just breathe and actually hear myself breathe and then go, as opposed to, oh, come on. It's been unbelievable. And occasionally I catch myself genuflecting. Sometimes I'm just not thinking. And other times I'm running late. And then I just, at the next one, I say, okay, in the past, then I would have beat myself up. Oh, you failed. You might as well give up. Bull crap. Just next one, get back to the full stop. And that full stop at the stop sign has been mind-bogglingly amazing as far as giving me some peace on the road.
That seems such a simple thing, but I can see how that could be powerful. I'm going to try and start doing that because I don't like coming to a complete stop at a stop sign either, unless I have to because traffic makes me. But man, I'll give that a shot. Thank you for that advice. And all right, we're going to wrap this up here after we hear any closing words of wisdom that you may have for us that you still feel the need to share.
Well, it's not mine. I mean, I'm sure most of you have heard it before, but don't leave before the miracle happens. If you're struggling to get sober, whether it's from alcohol, drugs, lust, rage, gambling, workaholism, I don't know. I don't know all of them, but whatever you got, keep coming back. And if you're sober and trying to get more recovery in your life, hopefully the idea that urgency and impatience can be the enemy of a slower recovery. One thing I didn't say, just I don't know why I didn't think of it, but something that ironically helped me. There were a lot of bad things about the pandemic, obviously, including that I lost a friend to COVID. I mean, it's a disaster. But one of the things that came out of it was I had to slow down. I couldn't go to my office. It wasn't open. I learned I had to work how to work from home. Yes, I got bored and tired of being at home all the time on the one hand. On the other hand, I kind of got into a rhythm of just hanging out with my wife, taking a walk, and realizing I don't have to be going 90 miles an hour. And it actually helped my recovery in that regard. So
thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and recovery therefrom. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have other questions, please go to RECO12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer others' questions that will come up. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you've not yet gone to RECO12.com and submitted your email address, you only need to do it once. Please get on the invitation list so that you can join us each week, Friday at noon Central Time. Next week, we'll have the pleasure of hearing from Nick P., who will be speaking to us about the missing piece of his life in recovery. Now, let's launch off into the rest of our day with the Serenity Prayer that Mike wanted us to do. Mike, would you like to be voicing that, or would you like me to? Okay, I'll do it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thy will, not mine, be done. Amen. All right. Keep coming back, everybody. It works when you work it, so work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching for glimmers of